Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us for another episode as we continue in our study through the book of Romans. If you're following along with us in your Bible or your tablet or your phone, we are in Romans chapter number 12. We've been going through this great book of doctrine that really unpacks all of the doctrine that comes with the gospel. Up to this point, Paul has been speaking, remember, to the Church of Rome. This is what we call a Pauline epistle. That simply means one of the epistles, one of the books written by Paul to the church. And each one of them, this is to the church at Rome. Please remember, these were letters, not necessarily created to be books, just letters of instruction and encouragement to the different churches that he had started. And so he's writing to the Church of Rome. And at this point, he's been talking about doctrine and what it means in the gospel and this new idea that wasn't really there before Jesus came to the earth. And he's been talking a lot up to this point about what does it mean for me? What am I gaining from this? What comes to my life and as a result of the gospel and of salvation? But now he starts in chapter 12. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for me to do? What is my part of it? And please understand, this is not guilting. This is not or I have to do this. This is really an outpouring of the gospel changing my life. Yesterday, we talked about the idea of presenting our bodies a living sacrifice and not be conformed to the thinking and the goals and the perspectives and the hopes of this life, but having our eyes on a different goal and on Jesus. And we look at that, and then we look now at, once we are willing to make that mindset, that renewed thinking, what does it look like in daily life? So we're going to start in chapter 12, verse 3, and unpack just a few verses here. Probably, as we go through what's known as spiritual gifts, more than likely do this in 2 episodes so that we can take a couple minutes to unpack it. But he starts in verse 3, Romans 12, verse 3. He says, For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. So he starts up by saying, to the grace given to me, I'm teaching you not as a master, as a dictator. This is what God has given to me, and I'm trying to teach you. He's encouraged you not to think of himself, anyone, to themselves more highly than they ought to think. So really what he starts off with is, if we're going to fulfill verses 1 and 2, the living sacrifice, not being conformed to the world, presenting our bodies, renewed thinking, it's going to start with humility. It's going to start with us being humble. But please understand, the context of these verses are talking about spiritual gifts, what God has given us to use in his church. So when you look at that, you see what God has given us to use in his church. What you see in this aspect of the spiritual gifts is God has given you something that you were to use for his glory. So why does he start off with humility? Well, it's a pretty simple point. If you go into a local church setting with a desire to serve, I promise you this, if you go in a desire to serve from an arrogant perspective, wanting, and here's what I mean by arrogant, things need to be your way. Everything has to be done the exact way you want it to be. If you serve, you need to be the one that's seen. Right? Everybody needs to see you doing it, and that way people can see how good you are, how talented you are, how much you've given. That is the opposite of what God's given us these gifts. God has given us these gifts to minister to others, not for ourselves. And so we look at this, if we come at it from a self-centered, arrogant perspective, we're never really going to serve. We'll get served, and I don't think God's going to bless it. We're going to go in, and I think a lot of times churches struggle because we go in, and we all can say this, we go in with a haughty perspective of who we are, and maybe we would never say this, but the church is lucky to have us, or this ministry is lucky to have us because of all of our talent. And then someone comes and tells us they want it differently, or we get put with someone else serving in that same ministry who's got very differing perspectives and gifts from us, and we get mad, and yet we don't know that the two working together can be so much better. But if we come at this from a self-serving, a preference-driven perspective, we're going to limit the ministry that we can do and that can be done in that ministry. But what does he say? Don't think more highly than you ought to think, but to think soberly. The word soberly is just clearly. I don't walk in and say, look how great I am. I walk in and say, okay, this is a gift I have. I've been given it from God. How can I use it? How can I use it best? How can I grow? Here's my strength. Hey, here's my weakness. How can I grow in this? Just to be honest. And sometimes that means you say, well, I think I'm really good at something, and yet no one has put me in that position yet. Well, maybe soberly I realize other people are noticing that my strength is not what I think my strength is. My strength may be something else. Or maybe God is saying, as soon as you're willing to serve in this area, then I will promote you to a better one. I've been in ministry long enough where I've watched some people that they'll serve in church as long as they're given a position of prominence, as long as they're seen. I've been in scenarios where you ask somebody to teach in a children's church scenario on Sunday, and I've been told this. That's beneath me. If you want me to preach in the pulpit on Sunday, I'll do that, but not in children's church. You see, that's the battle. If I've got a chance to serve, I need to serve. And if I'm thinking soberly, and again, not about me, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. So the other one is, be clear. What gift has God given me? And use that. It may not always be what builds my pride up, but it's not supposed to. I'm supposed to come at it selflessly. So not to think of himself more highly, but soberly. God has dealt to each one a measure of faith, which means other people may have a gift that I prefer to have, but God's given it to them. Verse 4, for as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function. So we have many members. So Paul begins this description from chapter 12, referring to the church and the gifts as a body. Now, here let me just start explaining this. It's simple, and you probably understand it, but we're going to walk through this illustration real quick. He uses it a body, give the idea that, he describes later in other aspects, but what's described is this idea, like a body. So you have one of the things that you look at. If you've ever done this years ago when I was in college, in activity, I broke my thumb. A thumb, one of the smaller parts of the body, seems relatively insignificant. I'm telling you, though, it is very insignificant until you can no longer use it, all right? When it's stuck in a cast or when it's in pain, it is amazing how something so small can affect so much of the body. And so you know what happens? The rest of the body hurts as a result of that. And that's really the way it should be, something that maybe the person sees themselves insignificant, maybe the church, they're new, they're not as well known, yet when they're hurting, the whole body should come together. The other part is this, though. If you've got a part of your body that's not, let's say it's out of joint. If you've got a hip out of joint, and you try to walk across just the room, you're going to have a hard time with it. Your leg's there. The hip's there. The part that's supposed to help the body perform and do what it needs to is there, but yet when you go to put weight on it, it doesn't work. It's very painful. It's not going to help. So what happens is the body now's got to drag this dead limb, per se, to make it work. When the body is connected and in joint, the hip is, and all of a sudden the whole body works together. So you see, when somebody that God has placed in the body is not willing to be humble, is not willing to be sober, recognize what God has given to them and others, and they kind of get out of joint, they want things their way, or they just won't serve, the body is limited. The church is limited because we're not working together. And one passage here talks about this. Do not, the eye doesn't say, since I'm not the hand, I'm not worth anything, or the ear, vice versa, that idea. We can look and say, I'm not valuable because I'm not leading worship, I'm not teaching, I'm not running this ministry, and yet God says there is not an invaluable or non-valuable part of the ministry. So the key is just serve. See, to me, if you truly want to serve humbly as God has dealt each measure, here's what I'm going to say. It might not be what you think you want at that moment, but if there's a place to serve, serve. Because here's the thing, it doesn't matter what people see, it doesn't matter if you're getting what you want, it matters, am I serving? And I believe this, you serve in an insignificant place, God will move you to a place of significance. But be very careful when we use the term insignificant or significant. I'll tell you why. You serve in what you might consider to be an insignificant place, and you have no idea how God can use you there. By the way, He can't use you there if you're not humble. He can't use you there if you're there the whole time saying it's not fair, no one's going to see me. Can I tell you, I was at a conference recently, or a meeting, and this man made a comment. He was referencing, the man was preaching, was referencing a companion of his, a companion in ministry. He named him, and he said this. He goes, none of you probably know who this man is, and he would have liked it that way. He then stated that through a ministry he had started with migrants, I believe it was, he was stating that they could show at least 30,000 different people who had been saved directly as a result of his ministry. Because you know what? He wanted nobody to know who he was, but he wanted people to know who Jesus was. That challenged me. Because how many times when we serve, I'll serve as long as I get what I want or I can be seen, and God's like, no, let me be seen. If we're living, what does he say? Don't think more highly we ought to think. Live soberly as God has dealt to each one. And if that's the premise, see, here's the point. If I have offering God a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to him, I'm not conformed to the world. Why am I not stop getting conformed to the world's thinking? Because the thinking is be seen, have a renewed thinking. A renewed thinking is how can I honor God and not be overly concerned about me? When I do all of those things, then I get to see God honored and glorified, and that's the key. So I guess I would finish this with this challenge. When we serve, are we serving in a place where I can allow God to be seen and not me? And that's the challenge. Am I working for Jesus to be seen, or am I working for me to be seen? If I'm working for me to be seen, I'll be seen. But yet God tells us in Scripture, I have my reward at that point. And I just don't think we're going to see God's blessing as much. And I think the church needs humble people to come and just say, Lord, wherever you want me, and serve passionately in that place and watch God bless that. Well, we do appreciate the wonderful privilege we have to be part of your day. Hope it's an encouragement. Next time, we'll pick up here and continue in chapter 12, diving a little more into the different spiritual gifts, what it means, and how we can use them for Jesus. Thanks.